Great to be with everybody. And thanks to Rachel Lipson, who is joining me for this next segment. She's been participating as a stakeholder in this economic recovery project. So we're about to jump into a little bit of a back and forth to give folks more of a sense of what we've been up to. A quick word of context for me. Again, I'm Russell Krumnow, the senior director on the staff. I oversee a lot of our programmatic work and have the fun challenge of taking this sort of high-minded idea of what convergence is about and trying to execute on it in the context of a specific issue through the dialogues that we lead. I want to thank a couple of folks who aren't getting airtime in the meeting. We have a very small team here, as I think many people know. So the heavy lifts of this work and building relationships and pushing the work forward is done by a very, very small number of people with the support, of course, of many folks like those on today's call. Omar El-Khatib leads all of our work in Capitol Hill, who I have the pleasure of working with closely on that. And Erica Loken works closely with me on our project-based work, some of which you're about to hear about. So thanks to both of them. I'm smart on this. If I'm ever smart on this stuff, it's because they're smart on it and make me smart. So Rachel, moving into a discussion about this specific topic, as many of the folks on the call know, Convergence previously had a dialogue called Working Up that met starting in 2016 for a couple of years, of which Rachel was not a part, and we're thrilled she is now engaged with us in this sort of new iteration. The Working Up project was aimed at increasing economic mobility, especially for low and moderate income Americans. And it released a whole set of recommendations. And they were not just around public policy. They also included a whole bunch of ideas of what the private sector can do, higher education, community colleges, philanthropy, faith-based groups. And some of the value out of that original stakeholder table that tackled how to make work a better engine of upward mobility is that it not only had right and left-leaning voices, which are of course critical and true of all convergence dialogues, but it really did have sectoral diversity. A lot of people working in the opportunity space or in the anti-poverty space in the past have not always meaningfully included the voices of business, for example. And so there's a lot of us now working in the space, not just convergence, many others recognizing that's essential. The demand side perspective is really critical. And so we thought a real value out of our dialogue and of the work we've been doing more recently was to have a strong business voice and a really strong perspective from people outside of Washington on the ground doing this work that are really close to the lived experience of what do people actually need to have upward mobility? What are the interlocking challenges preventing that? What does it look like to juggle childcare, to juggle a long commute from where you can afford rent to where your job is actually located? All of the many interlocking challenges that make accessing ladders of upward mobility very difficult for some Americans, even as other people are obviously doing quite well. Given the economic fallout from the pandemic, we've decided, we had a notion to bring back together part of that dialogue group and add some new perspective, folks like Rachel who've joined us over the last 6 months or so. And this group's goal has not been to develop a whole new set of recommendations. We kind of did that a couple of years ago with the original report. We've pulled that forward. And frankly, the landscape has been very fast moving. Congress has done multiple relief bills, and there have been many, many wide-ranging and innovative things happening in communities across the country, led by businesses, led by churches, led by nonprofits, led by individual citizens, to bolster people who are frankly losing their livelihoods and having a very difficult time given the huge economic fallout of the pandemic. So what we're going to do today is spend just a few minutes giving you a flavor of what those conversations have been in this economic recovery project over the last several months. And then we're going to look forward together and share with you, so where are we going? Because the goal of meeting the last several months with this reconstituted group, some of whom again participated before and some of whom have been new voices, the goal has been to share information, quickly vet good ideas, connect people who don't normally connect across right-left divides, but also, as I said, across sectoral divides, but also to issue spot and to figure out where could convergence more deeply work in 2021 on getting us out of this deep ditch. We know that the effort of economic recovery going forward, especially for people in low and moderate income work, or those who've lost jobs and now face long-term unemployment, we know that work is a long-term effort that requires everybody kind of rowing in the same direction. So we're trying to make some decisions now about a full-on economic recovery dialogue in 2021, and the effort the last several months has helped inform that. and paint a bit of a picture about where we're going to go. So with that, I welcome in Rachel from Harvard's Workforce Project, a relatively new initiative that's brings together multiple schools at Harvard. We're thrilled to have Rachel on. She's also done a ton of work herself on these issues very directly, having done work with groups like Year Up and others that work with youth and young adults to help get them on education and career pathways, which is a big part of success on these issues. So Rachel, to start, thanks so much for your participation in the last several months in Convergence's economic recovery conversations. I wanted to ask you, what have you learned? What value has this set of conversations brought? And specifically, if you can share a little bit about the value of these sort of cross-sector perspectives coming at it from different angles, all being in one group that's been meeting in recent months and all over Zoom, obviously.
Yeah, Russell, thank you for having me today, and also for having me over the last 6 months. I have to say that participating in this group has really been, in many ways, a breath of fresh air and a ray of light during what's been a really tough stretch for the country. And I find that jumping onto this Zoom room and kind of breaking down some of the traditional silos that exist and having people with fresh ideas who are ready to engage and ready to debate and ready to assume best intentions of each other. It's given me personally a lot of energy and a lot of hopefulness and optimism about the months that sit ahead. So I'm just grateful for having that opportunity to learn from others and kind of take that energy into my own work and how I think about what I want to apply from this pretty challenging time moving forward. I think one thing I'd say about these issues that we focus on in our economic recovery group is that um, it's a unique kind of space in that there has been some alignment for some years now that there is a problem, I would say. So there's not there has been some level of common acknowledgement across parties and then across business, across policy, across educators, that creating more pathways into economic mobility is something that we need to do. Where we've kind of stalled has been a lot around like what's the right set of solutions. And what I think has been really unique about this moment, and where I see the dialogue has added so much value over the last 6 months, is just the sense of urgency related to this particular crisis, and the way in which it's exacerbated some of the long-running trends that we've seen and really brought them out into the open in a way that you can't ignore them anymore. So Russell, as you've referenced, the economic effects of the pandemic as well as the public health effects are disproportionately affecting low-wage workers, women, people of color. And I thought that the dialogue, rather than kind of skirting around those issues, there was like a real acknowledgement of what's going on right now is just unacceptable in a way that in the past, uh, there wasn't that directness around acknowledgement of the problem. And that really kind of helped build some appetite towards how do we lift up some new voices? How do we create some kind of bias towards action? Where are some unfamiliar places that we might look for solutions, whether that be at innovations at the state and local level or the role of the private sector? But I felt that the group really had, a sense of like, this isn't something we can ignore anymore, and how can we kind of work together to drive from some sort of common identification of a problem to a common set of solutions. So I found that overall kind of tone to the group extremely helpful, and really derived a lot of energy from it in my own work.
Terrific. Thanks for all that, Rachel. And yeah, a couple of things you mentioned. We knew coming into this set of conversations that racial equity would be front and center, but we actually had that independently confirmed by, as you said, everybody in the group naming it and thinking hard about the fact that job losses have been disproportionately falling on people of color, especially women of color, and thinking hard about what are all the barriers to reconnecting, not just to any job, but to a good job with mobility, caregiving responsibilities being a big one. And then your good point about innovation, just getting some people back to the same jobs they had a year ago. In some cases might be a win. They might be happy to get back to that same job. We know for some folks, there's a transition. There's an inflection point. Some industries will not come back in the same way. We've got a really creative think about digital learning, new skills, pathing people into jobs that they may not have had before, because that might be what's available in the region in which they live. And so to take people inside the conversation a little bit, we've really had two broad buckets of issues emerge that we focused on. I think both threaded through with a framing around equity and around race and around thinking about making sure we don't want to have this sort of K-shaped recovery, which is essentially what's happening, right? Where some folks are bouncing back quickly and doing well, and we have some folks on another path that are facing a harder time. They're either underemployed or they're maybe facing longer term unemployment. And we know once people go past about 6 months without employment, actually 3 is pretty tough, but past about 6, you really start to have a harder time reconnecting. Your networks atrophy, and you look problematic to possible employers, which is unfortunate. And so the group's been thinking about 2 buckets. One is, how do we path those folks into good quality jobs? What are all the creative ways to do that? Subsidies, reskilling, that touches on things like digital access. There are many Americans in a country that's as wealthy as ours that don't have high-speed internet at home, and or don't have a device where they can access it, and or don't have the digital literacy to use it well. So that's a big barrier. That's a challenge. People also need good information, like, where can I get trained in 3 months to get a credential to earn a good job where I live? So the one bucket of challenges has been around skilling people and pathing them into high quality jobs. And then the second bucket, which is obviously bound up with that one, is, what are all the benefits and supports that surround work that make a good job a good job? So for some people, that's support around childcare or paid leave. There are lots of others on that list, obviously, but those are a couple that the group named in particular. Many people face caregiving challenges. Sometimes it's elder caregiving, sometimes it's with kids or something else in their life. But juggling all of that while they're trying to skill and train and get back into a job is enormously complex. So I'd love to hear you share a little bit about each of those buckets, and not just the challenge, which I've started to touch on, but where you're hopeful, where are there opportunities? Obviously, there's massive challenges with both, but what are some things we've talked about or some areas you're hopeful in the skilling and jobs pathway bucket, and then in the supports and kind of the childcare bucket?
Sure. I mean, first of all, Russell, you referenced that, obviously these two things match together. And I think that actually for me, it was a huge advantage of the dialogue over the last 6 months that we did link those two conversations. And I'd say kind of a difference from my day-to-day work for folks who work, I'm deep in the workforce development space and often can be stuck within the silos of people who are thinking all day and all night only about training, or potentially, about interactions between education and employers and policymakers, but without as deep engagement on these kind of related and corresponding issues, whether it be childcare and job quality. And so I thought that actually the linkage of those two dialogues made a lot of sense and added a lot of depth and value to our conversations, because obviously, like, to the extent that we're living in a universe of finite resources and resource constraints, trying to only think about one subset of these issues without the broader package of what are the implications on that, on the other pieces of life and wraparound supports that enable someone to actually get into a good job and then stay and maintain it and advance over time. So the linkage there of kind of the childcare work, and also we had a great discussion about unemployment insurance and kind of the relative strength or lack thereof of the social safety net, and what does it look like when people do suffer that shock in their life, what is standing to help support them as they make that transition, because we know that training and getting into a new career is something doesn't happen right away, and there's going to be an interim period, and it's a lot of different parts of society coming together to help support people, whether it be through the mental health implications of a job loss, of the community aspects of it. So anyway, I found like a lot of these thematic issues melded really nicely, and there was a really interesting kind of interplay happening from people who might focus particularly on childcare in their day-to-day work, adding really, really fresh perspective to a conversation about, workforce issues and career pathways.
Right.
In terms of some of the broad buckets of work and opportunities that, we aligned around, and there was a lot of momentum and energy, I think there was a lot of discussion about kind of how do we scale some of the successful innovations that have happened but have not reached kind of society at large and are particularly challenging at this moment. So that translated into discussions around kind of the intersection of the public higher education system, of our community college system, and some of these short-term private training efforts. What does it look like to have kind of integration of the best pieces of both into a sort of more holistic package of supports and responses in this moment on this skilling and pathways question. There was a lot of excitement about what it can look like, particularly in this moment of recession, to get more people experience and exposure to new types of career opportunities. So whether that
Right.
be, how do we support more chances for work integrated learning, for more people to get exposure to new types of jobs? What can kind of non-traditional ways of financing that look like, or to get people just that first bit of experience that you need to successfully make a transition into a new role and a new occupation. On the childcare front, I thought there was a good amount of energy and frustration about the limits of our current system, and the ways in which it's broken, and a lot of thoughts about sort of like the market constraints and what would solutions look like that could help us scale up more slots more quickly, and some really real acknowledgements about like what would be the funding required to make that happen, and where are the different parts of society that could come from, with I think some really good recognition from private sector colleagues in the group around like that the public sector alone wasn't necessarily going to be best positioned to foot the entirety of that bill, and that companies in this moment really recognizing a need to step up and create more opportunities for their employees to have care for their children and family members. So I also thought there was a lot of interesting directions that work can go, and I'm excited to see where the group comes out from here.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to flag for folks in a couple of minutes, we are going to spend some time in breakout discussions. So I want to, there's already some great comments coming in the chat, and a lot of interesting ideas about innovations folks are already involved with regard to skilling and sort of new careers. So appreciate that from folks. And there is going to be time to hear from you in breakouts in a bit, and that feedback will filter back to us as Convergence seeks input and guidance on which of these kind of focus areas we're actually going to lean into with a more formal dialogue going forward. But Rachel, I want to ask you, what's the cost if we don't succeed at this, if we don't do a good job, if we don't have an equitable recovery? We can all disagree about what that would actually look like, but if we fail at this, and then maybe flip it around to a more assets or positive based framing and ask you like what's possible if we do it well and propel ourselves forward on these paths. So as the new administration is 2 weeks old and thinks about its role, and frankly all of us have a role to play, as I think we've emphasized with our group, this is not just about solving a policy puzzle. That's really important, but there's a whole bunch of innovative stuff. We've seen companies like Target roll out an interesting childcare benefit during the pandemic to help their employees, juggle these issues. So there's a lot of things people can do. I know community colleges are right at the forefront of actively skilling folks who come from many non-traditional backgrounds. So there's a lot of actors involved. But what's the cost if we get this wrong, and what are the possibilities if we do a good job in the months ahead?
So I mean, I don't mean to be dramatic here, but I mean the stakes are quite high, and for many people in our country, it's literally a question of life or death right now.
Right.
So millions of people have lost their health care in the midst of a pandemic, which is what happens in our system when you lose your job. Um, uh, you know, those who who have been less likely to be able to work from home and therefore have been at the front lines of the pandemic are um, more likely to be below the median income. They're more likely to be renters, to not be born in this country, to not have a college degree, to be non-white, to not have employer-sponsored healthcare. We know that for displaced workers, when you lose a job, your mortality, your likelihood of mortality in the year following goes up 50 to 100%. We know that when a parent loses their jobs, there's long run implications for their child's performance in school. When we know that when communities lose jobs, the research tells us, like, for example, when communities lost manufacturing employment, causal relationship with rising opioid use and deaths. So there's some really startling research about, and that's not even to touch on, depression and mental health, or the health effects of the pandemic itself. So, I mean, the stakes are actually like quite high of the people in this country who have lost their jobs or lost hours due to this crisis. And I think in the short run, we can't forget about them. I do want to take this moment, and I think the aspirations towards what can we learn for this to create a more equitable ladder to opportunity moving forward is really important. But there's also like this near term, like very urgent issue of the folks who have lost their jobs right now. And what we saw in the Great Recession is that those effects persist, often for decades. If you lose a job, your earnings, you can see 20-year effects on your earnings from that job loss that you never catch up. And the longer that you're out of work, the longer, the more less likely it is that you're going to return. So anyway, I mean, all that's to say is, what's the cost if we don't do this well? I think it's a really, really high human cost, not even to mention the kind of political cost about the trust in our system and the adequacy of our response and our ability to deal with a crisis, and to create opportunities for people to, to work and to take home money for their families, to take care of their families. All of that, I think, is up in the air right now. And so how we respond is really going to matter for folks' belief in the system and our ability, to keep people alive. So that's a little bit of a depressing angle. I do think, there to our earlier comments about the opportunity for a cross-sector and cross-partisan solutions right now. Again, the Band-Aid has been ripped off. Our wounds are out there for society. And I think there is a lot of recognition that these problems are so big that they're not going to be solved by one sector alone. If you ask workers themselves, what are the challenges that you're facing right now when it comes to getting reemployed or for preparing for the future of work more broadly? They cite a lot of things, and the solutions span a bunch of these different stakeholders and actors. Folks aren't actually sure which programs they want to enroll in. So that hints at the need for the education sector to play a role at kind of helping with navigational guidance and creating these pathways. Folks talk about costs. That's not going to be necessarily solved by public policy alone. There's certainly a role for business in there as well, and for the education system at large. They also talk about, how do I find the time to retrain? And that's a question not just of an individual, but whether your employer supports you in accessing retraining, or if there's opportunities in your local community for you to access it. So I think that there's a moment right now where there's recognition that we have a huge problem. There's a recognition that different sectors have a role to play in addressing it. And I do think that one of the things that was most exciting that I heard from this group is that there were some unifying themes around this idea that there is no denying that, like, technology and this current shock has has altered and shaped and changed the way that we work, the opportunities that are available in the economy, and pretty broad consensus that, perhaps the education and training system hasn't moved fast enough to adapt, and perhaps was designed for an earlier era.
Right.
And in that way, I think because there's really an opportunity, through exposing how much has been broken, for looking at things that people thought were previously off limits, or to really starting from kind of a blank slate and thinking about, okay, if we were going to build a new system that connects education and career and jobs, or creates opportunity for more people, what would it look like? We see in this moment that some of the traditional rules around, whether it be around online delivery of curriculum, or changing the rules around work requirements for some of our public programs, or raising the wages of frontline workers, or direct stimulus payments. We're actually seeing a lot of real life experimentation right now, and things that, a year ago people never would have thought were possible or would happen. And I do think it's shifting the dialogue in a major way. So there's the
Yeah.
opportunity potentially to do something big and make some big investments, and not just prop up like a rickety existing system, but experiment with new things and see what we can learn um, moving forward, because the status quo, just so clearly isn't sufficient.
Yeah, fantastic. Rachel, thank you so much. I hope this gave people at least a very broad sense of the landscape. In just a few minutes here, it's hard to do these big, complicated issues justice, but we are about to go into breakouts. And the question for folks will be, based on what you're seeing, you all are plugged in to the national conversation, but also you're plugged into your own community. The question is where you hope the next stage of this discussion goes in a way that's most helpful to America's workers, as we decide internally about where a deeper, more structured dialogue might focus on that basket of issues around pathing people into jobs, or perhaps around some of the benefits and supports. We welcome folks to weigh in, but not just on that binary choice. We actually would love a rich discussion in your breakouts around what you're seeing and what you think the dialogue should focus on. Very briefly, I'll mention, somebody asked a good question in the chat, like, how do you know if you've been successful? There are a lot of ways for convergence dialogues to have impact. Sometimes we practically can see that a private sector company at our table went and did a XYZ thing, and it changed the lives of their workforce. That happened with the original Working Up dialogue with Walmart, which was a fulsome participant and did a whole bunch of things to expand the opportunity agenda internally for the biggest private sector workforce in the country. So sometimes there are things like that. But the other impacts of the project are sometimes harder to describe, but are knitting together groups that have never worked together. There have been people in this conversation in the last several months who did not know each other before at all, and now have an organic relationship kind of offline outside of our group. And they're talking about how to make unemployment insurance better. They're talking about a child allowance, which some folks might have seen that Senator Romney released a Republican proposal today for a child benefit that is a little different, but not that far off from President Biden's proposal. So there's actually some really exciting policy stuff in the mix coming from the right and the left on ways to bolster families and empower them, as well as the range of things going on in the private sector. So with that, why don't we go into our small groups? Rachel, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us this really broad overview, given your deep expertise. We're grateful for you and for your participation in the group. And now we're going to let everybody have some deeper conversation about what you heard and what you think convergence would be smart to focus on going forward. And after we come back on the backside of those breakouts, we'll let a couple of people share something compelling you heard in your small group conversation. Thanks everybody so much. We'll see you soon. Share with us a notion or a compelling idea that you heard in your breakout that you're going to be ruminating on, that you think the full group would benefit from hearing. We'd love to hear from a couple of people. So if anybody wants to use the raise hand, and you can chime in and share something interesting that was shared in your breakout on the big, crazy, interesting, important world of economic recovery. I'll share a comment in my group, and then I'll call on Tom, that folks were saying, there are some industries where we have a sense of where they're going to be going in the months ahead, but for some, it's a real guessing game. We're going to have to really reinvent ourselves. And that makes it very difficult to plan and to know what to fund and what to focus on, because for some industries, they're going to look very different, or perhaps not bounce back in the same way. Tom Dunn, go ahead. If you want to unmute yourself. And
yeah, in a way, I'm Am I unmuted now?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. It kind of relates to what you were saying, Russ. I was really surprised about in the discussion about how the current situation, COVID situation, is already changing and will change in unknown ways. Not only jobs, but actual what cities look like. I mean, and that kind of puts people who are scratching their heads over all this at a really, it's like, what's the future going to hold? Where's your crystal ball? This is a tough one.
Yeah, no question. Yeah, Simon, go ahead.
Well, we did talk about how cities might change, and I just want to add another thought we had, that sometimes it's hard to predict. And I'd mentioned before, we look at past black swan events, and during the event, we don't make good predictions of what it looks like 5 years after the event. So I'm circumspect, thinking half the offices will be empty in 5 years. I'm not sure. We have to see things develop more.
Right. None of us wants to be overconfident that we have it all figured out. Great comments in the chat. We welcome them there as well. I see David Eisner summarizing a point from his group that economic mobility continues to be an important theme, right? So what does a quality job that can help you move up and build wealth look like with the rapidly changing world of tech and the jobs that are available to different types of people? Anybody else want to chime in? Maybe one final comment if anybody wants to unmute and share a thought. Yeah, go ahead.
Russ, at the risk of being repetitive, as somebody said in the chat, this question about economic mobility and re-strengthening people's roles in the economy has got enormous breadth. There are so many sub-aspects to it. And I guess I would urge upon you and the team to really try to narrow down what the next area of dialogue is going to be. And I think this is a general principle, I think, in terms of any of Convergence's dialogues. We've been talking about trying to have diversity around the table of any dialogue. And of course, that's a value all of us cherish. But the question about how do you define that diversity is going to very much be dependent on how you're homing into a specific question. And I would think, with respect to this economic dialogue, it's even more significant because there's so many different facets to it. Are you going to talk about childcare? Are we going to talk about minimum wage? Are we going to talk about which industries are going to thrive and where? We literally can list dozens upon dozens. And it seems to me if there's a little work done first to say, here is the precise question we are going to predominantly focus on, then I think you can have an easier time figuring out what kind of diversity you need around the table to address that.
Yeah, it's a great point, Ron. We're going to put a poll up on the screen that's partly in service of what you just said. Now, the two areas you're going to see to choose between in the poll are themselves still very, very broad. So we have a lot more narrowing to do within either one. But we're curious to have folks react to this poll that basically lets you choose if you think Convergence should lean a little bit more toward the pathways and the skilling conversation, or a little bit more to the supports like childcare and paid leave. Feel free to just pick one of those quickly, recognizing you probably think they're both worthwhile, and you probably think they're both still way too broad. We hear that loud and clear. I'm seeing some really good comments in the chat about infrastructure. And so I think there's a good chance that we will lean into a conversation about infrastructure and how it could be a pathway to some of these quality jobs. And in the broadest sense, meaning broadband access and other pieces like that, in addition to sort of traditional transit and roads and such. And so we can go ahead and put once we get some responses, if somebody wants to put the results up on screen, feel free to share those with us. All right, interesting. So a decent lead there for the skilling and pathways conversation, although not a blowout. So unsurprising that folks are interested in both. Well, thank you so much for engaging in that discussion. I know there's a lot more we could say. Many of you have a lot of ideas you're continuing to share in the chat. We're going to read all of those. And I personally look forward, as I am in the churn right now of trying to figure out and listen to lots of smart people who don't all agree on where this dialogue should go. I also, I'm going to take those comments under advisement and welcome your good ideas. I'm going to very, very briefly mention, completely shifting gears, another dialogue I am also leading at Convergence right now, just to let you know that it's still going. We've shared about it in past Leadership Council meetings and likely we'll focus more on it in the future, but we just wanted to put a pin and make sure people know there's a group of stakeholders meeting right now. You got a written update about this in your materials, focused on firearms and preventing firearm suicide. So that is Convergence's entry point into the guns conversation that many of you have asked us for years to tackle. We did a very thoughtful and long analysis and assessment to decide that understanding gun ownership and preventing firearm suicide was the part of the conversation where we could add value and we could start, given that the vast majority of gun deaths are suicides every year, even though there are lots of other misuse of firearms that ruins lives. That's the place we're starting. The group is meeting proactively. They've now met a few times. We're having a really rich discussion. There are strong gun rights advocates in the stakeholder group. There are strong leaders in the gun violence sort of prevention world, and a number of really interesting people that are public health experts, that are practicing doctors, that are mental health professionals. There are people with specializations around key populations like veterans, LGBT youth, that have sort of higher risk factors at play. And we are now pivoting into more of a discussion about solutions. So the dialogue has done a lot of sort of foundation setting and shared learning and building some connective ties. And now we're really going to be getting into the hard discussions about what are the programmatic and policy interventions we could possibly pursue as a group that would help bring down the number of firearm suicides. As folks probably know, suicide in the US has been rising really over 20 years. This is a long-term problem. The numbers are going in the wrong direction. And there's been a particular spike in isolation, which can contribute to ideation and suicide attempts during the pandemic, because a lot of people are experiencing both social and economic isolation. So there's actually a real urgency to this question, even though it's a longer term challenge in the country. And of course, around half of suicides use a firearm as the method. So we'll report back more later as that group gets a little bit further down the field, but I just wanted to reassure everybody that project is ongoing. I'm really encouraged by it. There have been some very inspiring and difficult moments. And even after there's sort of very hard to watch a mob attack of the Capitol a few weeks ago, the group has since met. And although that was not the focus of our dialogue or our discussion, some of the people in the group shared that they called each other and talked it out. And we're like, what am I watching? What is going on? Help me understand this, because I know you're from a different perspective than me. And so we were gratified that our dialogue has been able to build enough relationships and connective tissue that even during very difficult, hard to understand moments, people in the group are seeking each other out as a sounding board, which is exactly the kind of relationship that we want to build in our Convergence projects as we move towards solutions. So with that, I'll wrap up my portion on these programmatic updates. I know there were other hands up and other comments in the chat. I promise we will read them all, and the staff will collect those to make sure we get to see them after the conversation. And I'll hand it back over to our leader for the meeting, Amanda Brown.